Now, this is Martin Hughes from the blog Barrier Breaker. Some time ago, I came across a video in which black culture was called a victim cult. And since that time, repeatedly, over and over again, this point has been made in various ways by the same individual, an individual by the name of T.J. Kirk, an atheist who calls himself amazing, and thereby goes by the moniker on YouTube of the Amazing Atheist. I responded to this comment, and when I did, with fairly strong wording, I was immediately addressed by thousands of supporters of the Amazing Atheists. Had a 4-hour conversation that, kind of bled into about 7 hours with the Amazing Atheist. Watched a video he made addressing me directly. Watched a few other videos commenting on the whole exchange. And most of these interactions have had a common goal: telling me, as a cult member of black culture, which is obviously, apparently, a victim cult, how to stop being labeled by them as said member of a victim cult. So I've listened, and I've heard what people have repeatedly said. Not just the Amazing Atheist, but his surrogates and his fans. And so, in listening to this, and in arguments back and forth with thousands of his fans, I decided a while ago to write up a guide for black culture, to tell them how they can avoid being called a victim cult by the Amazing Atheist and his friends. Because as we all know, there is nothing in our lives that is more important than making sure that the Amazing Atheist and his friends don't think that we're victims. We can't have that. So, the comments that started this, first he said, quote, "If I hate anything about black culture, it's that it's such a victim culture. Almost a victim cult, Our Lady of Perpetual Victimization." And then when I criticized that, he said, I was mistaken when I said black culture was almost a victim cult. I should have said outright that it was a victim cult. This is not a fluke. This is something he said repeatedly. This is how he sees black culture. This is how, during our conversations, he has described black culture. And if you want to get into the specifics, if you want to figure out why he thinks black culture is a bunch of whiny individuals who should just shut up and should not be listened to at all, period, zip, zam, zero, zilch, when they talk about the inequalities in this country. If you want a thorough discussion of this, this is what I'd like to give you here. An education on what we all know, because this atheist who calls himself amazing and has 1 million subscribers, we all know we need to pay attention to him. He needs to be our highest priority. This is how you avoid being part of black culture. First, you need to stop being part of, and I just want to pause here and say, there's citations for all this information that I'm going to give you in the description to this video. So If you're looking for citations, they're there. First, stop being part of black culture, as black culture is a victim cult. This may be difficult if you are black, but apparently it's important. Then realize that the old saying, those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it, may apply to most culture, but somehow it doesn't apply to black culture. So no, you don't get to talk about slavery or segregation as if they are remotely relevant to the struggles we face now. You can't talk about the drug war or anything or any inequalities that have happened in our country as if they're remotely relevant to the struggles that we face now in any way that we should do something about. So it's probably best for you not to read about the history of racism, because if you do, you might read ridiculous historians claiming that many of the slums and education inequalities, don't read about redlining for Pete's sake, and poverty and so on we have today can be directly linked to hundreds of years of hammered in consistent racism in this country, and you might stop feeling adequately responsible for yourself because you, black people, you, black culture, you, black victim cult, you have to take responsibility for the racism that is shown against you in this country. Don't look to anyone else to help. You're not in a position to point out how you got here, as if that's relevant, even remotely, because that's going to annoy TJ and his friends, and we all know that's got to be our highest priority. You got to try to frame any racism that you experience in your life as your personal fault. Take some goddamn responsibility, and if you can't really do that, it's obviously not serious enough to give you any significant barriers in your life. It's something we should leave alone. So if you can't get to taking responsibility for the racism other people show towards you, then ignore it. Stop complaining about it. Because if you do, you'll force TJ and his friends to complain about the fact you're complaining about it. Another thing you need to do is get your son or daughter educated. And when you see articles like the one I have entitled in the description, a black college student has the same chances of getting a job as a white high school dropout, smile approvingly, because that's the way it is and should be. Your kid should be just as likely to get a job with a college degree as a white high school dropout. Or be ashamed by that statistic, because that's the way you made it, black culture. Or better yet, ignore it. This may be difficult if you want your son or daughter to have a fair shot at life, so that desire is something you should get rid of too. Just be happy for the white high school dropout and stop caring so much about your kid being treated fairly. Life isn't fair. Accept it and stop complaining, black culture, or you might get the amazing atheist and his friends complaining about you, and you know that should be your highest priority. We can't have that. And don't you dare look at any of the teachers when you find that in preschool, as in at 4 years old, your child is going to be more than twice as likely to be suspended than a white child, black culture. No, you're not allowed to say that has anything to do with racism. And if you do, you should admit that this racism is your fault. And if it's too hard for you to admit that this is all your fault, at least admit that that fact's insignificant. The fact that your child is going to be more than twice as likely to be suspended than a white child shouldn't make a goddamn difference. That is, if you're not weak, if you don't want to be part of TJ and company's victim cult, don't ever bring shit up like the following quote that I got that's from this article, Race, Disability, and the School to Prison Pipeline, that you can find in the description. Quote, during the 2011 school year, more than 3 million public school students were suspended and over 100,000 expelled. These students were overwhelmingly black. According to the Department of Education, black students are suspended and expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. Save for American Indians, no other racial group experiences such outsized racial disproportionality and exclusionary discipline. Indeed, the federal government has said that the racial disparity and punishment levels can't be explained by differences in kids' behavior alone. Importantly, just one of those suspensions can double the likelihood that students will drop out of school and increase the likelihood that students end up in prison. End quote. You're not allowed to think about the implications of these statistics. You're not allowed to say that maybe these trends were worse in the previous generation, leading to a higher percentage of student dropouts and a higher amount of dropouts in prison, which led to father-free homes that perpetuated the cycle. Remember, you have to say that that's irrelevant to the struggle we face now. And if you do admit there's some relevance, you have to admit that it's your fault, one way or another, how the teachers are treating your child. I don't care how tough that may be, because the important thing is to keep TJ and his friends from thinking that you're part of a victim cult, that you're trying to convince teachers to be fair in the school your child goes to. As I'm sure you know, you're not a victim, are you? That would be so much worse. Going and talking to your teachers about making sure that your kid, to the teachers about making sure your kid is treated fairly, would be so much worse than being part of TJ and Al's victim cult. What you need to do is tell your son or daughter who is experiencing these so-called disparities to simply suck it up. And also, if your son does make it to college, don't let it bother you when you hear that he'll be 3 times more likely than his white friends to be pulled over, even though he's less likely to have something on him. That if he does decide to smoke weed, he'll be more likely to be arrested for it. That he's more likely to spend time in jail while awaiting a trial than his white friends if he's accused of a crime, whether he's guilty or innocent. Or that any plea deal he gets is more likely to include prison time. Now, as long as you're not talking specifically about black people, if you're talking about the general population, you want to make TJ and his friends happy, you're allowed to say that the prison and justice system is bad. You just can't say that it negatively affects black people specifically in any, significantly race-related way, because the moment you bring that up, you'll be part of a victim cult, and we know how important avoiding that is, don't we? For example, you might be able to admit that black people are twice as likely to be struck from a jury pool as white people, but you can't admit that this indicates any significant racism. You might be able to say that the black people were just poor or something. And even if they weren't poor, that's not a big deal. It's much more important for you to be okay with inequality if you don't want to be part of a victim cult. So you can't complain about that. Disparity in jury selection. And you should argue in favor of tolerant rehabilitative prison systems as long as you're talking about the general population. But you're not allowed to complain about the so-called fact that your skin tone makes you more likely to get your probation revoked than the skin tone of white people or other minorities, even when controlling for poverty, severity of the crime, and other factors. I mean, you can bring up the inequality briefly, and the Amazing Atheist did in one 10-minute video on incarceration in 2011, where he said, quote, "Some say that the reason America has the highest incarceration in the world has to do with race. America has more black and Hispanic people than Europe, and therefore more crime. But does America have more black people than South Africa, where black males make up 79.4% of the population?" Then he shows that even though black people make up a high amount of the population, there's lower crime than there is in the United States. So, therefore it doesn't have to do with race. But if somebody does bring up race as a relevant factor, you have to say that it's all about poverty and crime and the black victim culture. It's all black people's fault. It has nothing to do with the way they are treated. And even if it did, the way they are treated would be their fault too. Now you can loosen up and blame it on someone else when you're talking about the general population, like predominantly white people and not black people, though, according to the amazing atheist, who said this in that same video, quote, "Do you," and then he points his finger, "you, Mr. Audience, Mrs. Audience, Miss Audience, whatever, do you accept the idea that 3.1% of Americans are criminals? And if so, then why? Why are there way more criminals in America than there are in any other country?" End quote. Like the amazing atheist in this video, you can skip the assumption that the general population is just more deserving of prison than any other country's population, as long as you're not talking specifically about black people. And you could say that it's due to, you could say that assigning the blame to poverty is obviously ridiculous and goes straight to the problem of privatization of prisons. That's not playing the victim card, supposedly, because then it includes all races and, of course, you know, mostly white people. But all races, right? But when it comes to the Sentence Project's testimony to Congress that, quote, "If current trends continue, 1 of every 3 black American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino males, compared to 1 out of every 17 white males," end quote. When it comes to those discrepancies, you're not allowed to complain. If you don't want TJ and his friends to say you're part of some kind of victim cult, you have to say that it's all black people's fault for being part of victim culture. And you can't say that's inconsistent. You can't say that that's a double standard, because if you do, you know, then it can't be that, you know, the amazing atheist is making a racist argument. It has to be that you're part of a victim culture. Now, one thing you are allowed to say is that black people are just poorer. You can blame it on poverty in the case of black people, but be careful. This may prompt some to wonder how much poorer black people in America are than black people in any other country in the world, seeing as how every other country in the world, even those with higher black populations, all have lower incarceration rates. You're not allowed to think about that. And why are black people poorer? You're allowed to say it's because they're lazy. You're allowed to say it's because the supposedly shitty fathers are absentee. Just don't bring up unequal prison rates creating more absent fathers, because that would be looking at the past, which is supposedly not allowed. You're also allowed to say it's because they play the victim card. But you can't bring up the unequal education aspect or any other aspect or any history or anything to explain the predominance of black poverty by any other factors, because then you'd experience the terrible fate of being condemned by TJ and his friends as belonging to a victim cult. When the Sentencing Project says, quote, "Today people of color make up 37% of the U.S. population, but 67% of the prison population," end quote, you just need to accept that many people who are not white are criminals, even when it's not right to accept the idea that 3.1% of Americans in general are criminals. And don't pretend that racial inequality has any psychological consequences that may lead to a fear that might drive crime. It may help not to get schooling in the wimpy field of psychology these days for this one, because these psychologists are just big enablers nowadays, or at least that's what you'd have to think if you're part of T.J. Kirk's victim cult. As this psychologist states, quote, and this psychologist, Carolyn Gregor, states, quote, "People get depressed and they get afraid, fearful, and anxious, and can come up physically with high blood pressure and heart disease. There are big studies being done on how even sleep is affected by racial inequality, because racism keeps victimized people from being able to settle down. They are always hypervigilant because someone or something in the environment is going to threaten them based on their race. They are fearful all the time," end quote. Here's how you're supposed to respond to that. Ew! What a member of a victim cult. What does her face look like? Does she have a double chin? Look at the shape of her nose, and she's a woman. How can we trust anything she says, stupid fucking victim? Just all you're allowed to do is look at the goddamn crime rates by themselves of black people. Rules change when you switch to the general population, remember, and say it's because black culture is a victim cult. How hard is that, black people? Stop with all these extra statistics and studies that claim you're a victim, and fix the problem by just following the expert T.J. Kirk and his friends' advice on not being part of a victim cult. Nothing else. Don't do studies. Don't read studies. And if you do, don't use the facts from them to actually fix anything in the system. Rely on TJ and company's truthiness. It's all your fault. Now, please don't hurt the tender sensibilities of TJ and his crew by bringing up racism in the medical system. And if you do bring it up, don't admit that you're bothered by the fact that you have a bigger chance of dying in a hospital than a white person. TJ and his friends would say you're in a victim cult. You should rather just be okay with it. Don't be like this physician, Ronald M. Wyatt, ignorantly joining TJ and company's victim cult by spouting studies claiming to show that, quote, healthcare organizations must be held accountable for the shameful and embarrassing data that screams out that black and other minorities are not receiving equal treatment. The data tells us that if you are black, Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, Alaskan Native, or another minority, then your healthcare outcomes are worse. For black people, this is true regardless of income, zip code, profession, or educational status. End quote. Only members of a victim cult will bring up that fact. What you're supposed to do is just accept the fact that your father is more likely to die when you have to rush them to the emergency room. Or better yet, look at the way your father's treated and shamed for yourself and your mistakes. Your father's more likely to die because it's your fault. This unequal treatment is your fault. I mean, we couldn't find out how it's your fault and your income, your zip code, your profession, your education. But if you don't want to be in T.J. Kirk's personal victim cult, you have to admit that there's something that you did that's your fault making this happen. TJ and his friends know it in their gut. It's your fault somehow, and their view of it has to be your highest priority. To say anything else is to engage in a victim cult mentality that might offend TJ and his fans. You wouldn't want to do that, right? You wouldn't want to make them upset just to demand equal medical treatment, you oversensitive fucking prick. You need to make sure you take better care of TJ and his friends' feelings. Don't do something contrary to their guts. Try to look at it from their perspective. They might get offended at your victim attitude. I mean, seriously, why the fuck would a member of such a victim cult have a right to care about their father so much they think that drastically unequal treatment at the hospital, even when controlling for income, zip code, profession, and educational rates, is maybe racism's fault, and become part of the victim cult? Now, this is not saying you can't care about black people. You can have black friends. You just can't care about any claims that they experience racism. Don't question whether that's actually being their friend. The best way to be a friend to a black person in America is to tell them to follow these steps to leave the victim cult. And employment. You're allowed to say maybe that there is racism in employment, but you're not allowed to say it's in any way a substantial barrier in getting a job. I mean, Obama's president, after 43 white presidents, but that doesn't matter. So that proves that racism isn't a thing. I mean, racism against Obama, contrary to member of black culture Jamelle Bouie, has nothing to do with someone as outrageous as Trump winning the Republican nomination. And I have the Jamelle Bouie article that's absolutely, supposedly, completely ridiculous in the description. And you never want to bring up whether racism cost Obama points in the election, because studies indicate that it doesn't matter. Because studies are, as I'm sure you can tell, done by the victim cult, according to T.J. Kirk and his friends, who are supposedly always right. But it's fun and okay to laugh at studies. So here are some studies for you to laugh at. I have a quote from an article, but there's several studies hyperlinked. I'll put the studies that are hyperlinked in the description as well. Quote, from this article, quote, but the political science literature suggests that in reality, Obama lost votes in 2008 due to white prejudice. Political scientist Spencer Piston finds that whites who negatively stereotype black people were dramatically less likely to vote for Obama. Importantly, he finds that stereotypes don't reduce support for Biden, Clinton, or the Democratic Party in general. By using racially charged Google searches, economist Seth Stevens Davidowitz estimates that racism cost Obama 4 points in the national popular vote. He finds that the racially charged search rate affects Obama's performance in 2008, but not John Kerry's performance in 2004. Political scientists Jason Wendet, Kevin Banda, and Thomas Carsey find that racially prejudiced whites viewed Obama more negatively and were less likely to vote for him. They estimate that racism cost Obama between 2.2 million and 5.7 million votes. Political scientist Michael Tesler found that, quote, the effects of racial resentment on support for Republican presidential candidates were roughly twice as large in Obama's two elections as their average effects were between 1988 and 2004, end quote. And that's the end of the overall quotes. Oh, man. Victim cult studies done by Spencer Piston and the economist Stevens Davidowitz and Jason Wendet and Kevin Banda and Thomas Carsey and Michael Tesler and who knows who else. They're all wrong because that would offend TJ and his friends. So here's what we could do. We can laugh at it. They're so hilarious. They're so ignorant. All we need to do is get out of the victim cult that has all these studies and annoying facts and just get in touch with TJ Kirk and his friends' guts, their truthiness, because it might fly in the face of a few dozen facts, but it will keep you out of the victim cult, so long as you find a way to get out of black culture, which might be hard because of your skin, but that's your fault. And also, don't bring up that study, and I have that linked in the description, that those with black-sounding names are less likely to get a job than those with white-sounding names. It probably just revealed at the most poverty-based employment discrimination anyway, even though the study claimed that the gap was still there when black people were placed in better neighborhoods. Quote, first, since we randomly assign applicants' postal addresses to the resumes, we can study the effect of neighborhood of residence on the probability of callback. We find that living in a wealthier or more educated or more white neighborhood increases callback rates. But interestingly, African Americans are not helped more than whites by living in a quote-unquote better neighborhood, end quote. So here's what you have to say about stuff like those studies. You have to say that's typical victim cult rhetoric. Even saying that even when black people lived in a better neighborhood, they were still less likely to get a callback than whites. What they need to realize is that it's black people's fault. Black people need to start giving their kids different names or something like that. Somehow. Get in a better neighborhood. And if the study is right and it doesn't help, then, I mean, the solution is that you're hurting yourself, right? You got the rhetoric, get it right. You can say there's racism, but you're not allowed to say racism is a significant cause because then you'll be part of the victim cult, and you don't want that. I mean, that would lead to tragedies, like convincing companies to look at resumes blind or something. What a ridiculous idea, fostered by white guilt. I mean, look at how brain-dead Britain looks when doing it. Quote, HSBC, Deloitte, Virgin Money, KPMG, the BBC, the National Health Services, local governments, and civil service have all signed up for the, quote, name-blind hiring, end quote, initiative prompted by the UK government. Quote, The program will help prevent unconscious bias and ensure that job offers are made on the basis of potential, not ethnicity, gender, or past personal circumstance, end quote, said Davis Rowe, CEO of Deloitte. Deloitte said it would go further and interview candidates for its graduate intake without knowing which school or university they attended. Prime Minister David Cameron said last month it was, quote, disgraceful, end quote, that people with, quote, white-sounding names, end quote, were twice as likely as others to be shortlisted for jobs. But the name bias is not just a British problem. OECD researchers found that a foreign name makes a job search harder for applicants across all 17 developed countries it surveyed. In the United States, the situation is the worst for people with distinctively black names, such as Jamal and Lakeisha, researchers noted. That's the end of the article. Isn't that a stupid enabling solution for the victim cult crowd? What needs to happen, if you don't want to be part of the victim cult, this has to be your opinion. Now, what needs to happen is that black people need to change their names to sound more white. And when you change it, don't go on about how you miss your old name, black people. This is the fucking price. TJ and his friends don't want you to dare mouth a complaint about being in a victim cult, so you're just gonna have to deal with it. And don't say studies done recently are relevant either. Like these. This is an article from the Huffington Post, but there are quite a few studies cited, so I'm going to put all the studies that are cited in the description as well. Students with stereotypically black-sounding names tend to be labeled as troublemakers by teachers. Job applicants with such names are less likely than their white-sounding counterparts to get called in for interviews. When residents with black-sounding names contact their local government for information about schools or libraries, they are less likely to receive a response. Adding to this troubling compendium of results is a disturbing new study published Thursday in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior. The study of mostly white participants shows that men with black-sounding names are more likely to be imagined as physically large, dangerous, and violent than those with stereotypically white-sounding names. Dr. Colin Holbrook, a research scientist at the UCLA Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, and lead author of the study, said that he has never been so disgusted by his own data. End quote. So here's what you're supposed to do. This is the right response. Colon sounds like colon. Like the body part, right? Like how can you trust someone whose first name sounds like colon? Sorry. I know that was weak. I'll get there. In all fairness, I didn't have a pic of his nose, eyes, or mouth handy to show he was wrong. Anyway, pro tip: you can make fun of these studies by finding out that some white people have black-sounding names like Jamal too, because it's totally about the names. It has nothing to do with the people possibly being black. Don't think otherwise, because it doesn't at all. Like Jamal, you have to think that Jamal can just as easily be a black name as a white name. Just, honestly. Because the danger here, you understand, is that if you said that racism did have something to do with it, you would be urging people, black and white, and all races, as the studies are stupidly claiming all races are implicitly biased against black people, to think seriously about solving racism. And, worst of all, you'd be part of TJ and his friends' victim cult. I mean, think of how victim culty people have been when they have actually tried to do this. Like the American Bar Association actually was ridiculous enough to ignore TJ and his friends' advice. I mean, that kind of ruins the credibility of the American Bar Association, doesn't it? That they're not willing to agree with TJ. And they actually fought racial bias in the courtroom with this nonsense, quote, "Given the substantial and growing scientific literature on implicit bias, the time has now come to confront a critical question. What, if anything, should we do about implicit bias in the courtroom?" The author team comprises legal academics, scientists, researchers, and even a sitting federal judge who seek to answer this question in accordance with behavioral realism. The article first provides a succinct scientific introduction to implicit bias with some important theoretical clarifications that distinguish between explicit, implicit, and structural forms of bias. Next, the article applies a science of two trajectories of bias relevant to the courtroom. One story follows a criminal defendant path, the other story follows a civil employment discrimination path. This application involves not only a focused scientific review, but also a step-by-step examination of how criminal and civil trials proceed. Finally, the article examines various concrete intervention strategies to counter implicit biases for key players in the justice system, such as the judge and jury, and it goes on for a substantial number, for about 62 pages. So now, so that's basically some of the intro. Wow. So now you've got to make fun of the study. So the first step is to make fun of the authors. Let's see, there's Jeffrey King, Judge Mark Bennett, Devin Carbato, Pam Casey, Nilajana Dasgupta. Man, you might be able to make fun of that name, and to show that the study is wrong. David Figman, Rachel Godsill, Anthony G. Greenwald, Justin Levinson, Jennifer Nukin. That sounds funny. That's a funny name, right? Nukin. That could be good. Let's see. Jerry King is professor of law at UCLA. Yeah, he's academia who wants to listen to somebody who's a lawyer. U.S. District Judge, he's probably a politician, don't listen to him. Professor of Law, UCLA School of Law, academic, don't listen to him. Research consultant at the National Center for State Courts. Yeah, just don't listen to him. He's a researcher. He's read books. You don't want to listen to people like that. Associate Professor of Psychology. Oh, Psychologist. They're all cooks. Don't listen to Psychologist. John F. DeGardy, Distinguished Professor. Oh, he probably is a little proud of himself. Of Law at UC Hastings College of Law. Director. Oh, he has a bunch of stuff that he's... don't listen to him. His academic pedigree is too much. He doesn't know nearly as much as TJ. Rachel Godsill, Eleanor Bontecu, Professor of Law, Seton. He's a professor. Who cares about professors? They don't know anything. Anthony Greenwald, Professor of Psychology. Who wants to listen to a Professor of Psychology? They're freaking ignorant. Associate Professor of Law, Director of Cultural Jury Project. Professor. Yeah, I mean, this is really, what they need to do is actually listen to TJ and his friends. And, it might take a little while. You might have to collect up some pictures it would take too long to make fun of their skin, eyes, and noses to, show how they're wrong. But anyway, I'll leave you to it. What victim cultures, though, huh? So wrong to even start thinking this way. There's more I could say, obviously, but yeah, I hope this served as a primer to avoid being in the victim cult. For the sake of the amazing atheist comfort and entertainment, black culture, stop being black culture. Stop caring about studies, looking to explore facts. Fill your world from T.J. Kirk and his friends' god of truthiness. Unless, of course, you don't give a damn.